Stockholm, 1943. A Swedish businessman sits in a cafe reading the morning edition of Svenska Dagbladet, one of Sweden's major newspapers. He sips his coffee, scanning the headlines about the war raging across Europe while neutral Sweden maintains its precarious independence. His eyes move across an article about shipping schedules in the Baltic Sea, routine commercial news for a maritime nation. But this businessman isn't reading casually. He's decoding. The shipping schedule isn't just commercial news, it's an intelligence message. The departure times, vessel names, and port destinations contain encoded information about German U-boat movements, information desperately needed by British naval intelligence. This businessman is an Allied intelligence officer operating under commercial cover in neutral Stockholm, and the newspaper is his communication channel. 50 meters away, a German intelligence officer reads the same newspaper at another cafe. He too is decoding, but extracting different information from different articles. A financial report about Swedish steel exports contains intelligence about Allied convoy routes. A cultural review mentions specific Swedish towns in a pattern that encodes Luftwaffe reconnaissance priorities. The same newspaper simultaneously serves Allied and Axis intelligence operations, with neither side fully aware of the other's codes hidden within the same pages. Welcome to Cipher Tales. Today, we decode one of World War II's most extraordinary intelligence operations, how neutral Sweden's newspapers became covert communication networks for multiple intelligence services. This is the story of Swedish journalists who knowingly or unknowingly facilitated espionage, of codes hidden in plain sight within commercial news, and of how one country's neutrality created unique opportunities for invisible information warfare. This is the story of Sweden's newspapers, where every article might contain secrets, every advertisement could be an intelligence drop, and where the line between journalism and espionage disappeared entirely. Swedish neutrality, the impossible balance. To understand how Swedish newspapers became intelligence channels, we must first understand Sweden's extraordinarily difficult position during World War II, maintaining neutrality while surrounded by powers that wanted to drag Sweden into the conflict or exploit its neutral status. Sweden had maintained neutrality during World War I, and when World War II began in September 1939, Sweden declared neutrality again. But the geography and economics made this neutrality far more complicated than simple non-participation. Sweden bordered Nazi-occupied Norway and Finland, which was forced into alliance with Germany after Soviet invasion. The Baltic Sea, crucial to Swedish commerce, became a combat zone where German and Soviet naval forces clashed. Sweden possessed resources that both sides desperately wanted. Swedish iron ore was critical to German steel production and thus to the Nazi war machine. Swedish ball bearings were essential for aircraft and tank manufacturing. Swedish forests provided timber and wood pulp for various military applications. Both Allied and Axis powers sought Swedish resources, creating economic pressure that threatened Swedish neutrality. The threat of invasion loomed constantly. Germany had invaded Denmark and Norway in April 1940, demonstrating that neutrality provided no protection when German strategic interests demanded territorial control. Sweden faced credible threats that refusing German demands might trigger invasion. Simultaneously, Sweden faced pressure from the Allies, particularly Britain, to restrict trade with Germany and provide intelligence about German activities. Swedish neutrality became a delicate balancing act. Sweden made concessions to Germany, allowing transit of German troops and materials through Swedish territory, maintaining iron ore exports. Simultaneously, Sweden maintained relations with the Allies, providing some intelligence and allowing limited Allied operations on Swedish soil. This policy satisfied neither side, but allowed Sweden to survive the war without occupation. Within this context, Swedish newspapers operated under unique freedoms and constraints. Unlike newspapers in occupied nations or in combatant countries, Swedish press maintained relative independence. Swedish censorship existed, but was far less restrictive than German, Soviet, or even Allied wartime censorship. Swedish newspapers could publish information about the war that would be suppressed in other nations, making Swedish press valuable sources for intelligence services monitoring neutral reporting. But Swedish authorities understood their newspapers were being exploited for intelligence purposes. Swedish counterintelligence, the C-Byrån, under Swedish military intelligence, monitored both Allied and Axis intelligence operations in Sweden. They knew that foreign intelligence services were using Swedish newspapers for covert communications, but adopted a pragmatic approach. As long as these operations didn't threaten Swedish security directly, authorities often chose not to interfere aggressively. This created an extraordinary situation where Swedish newspapers became de facto intelligence infrastructure for multiple powers simultaneously. Allied intelligence used Swedish papers to communicate with networks across occupied Europe. German intelligence used the same papers for their communications. Soviet intelligence operated their own coding systems within Swedish publications. And Swedish intelligence monitored all of it, extracting intelligence from the foreign intelligence communications hidden in their own newspapers. Swedish journalists occupied ambiguous positions in this system. Some actively collaborated with intelligence services, Allied, Axis, or Swedish, embedding codes or facilitating intelligence operations. Others were unknowingly exploited, writing innocuous articles that intelligence services used as coding frameworks. Others suspected their work was being used for espionage, but chose not to investigate too deeply, recognizing that Swedish neutrality depended partly on providing these informal intelligence channels to all sides.
The codes, how intelligence was hidden. Multiple intelligence services developed sophisticated methods for embedding codes in Swedish newspapers. Understanding these techniques reveals both cryptographic ingenuity and the unique advantages Swedish neutral press provided for covert communications. The most basic technique used pre-arranged personal advertisements. Intelligence operatives would place classified ads in Swedish newspapers using specific wording that encoded messages. These ads appeared ordinary, people seeking apartments, selling furniture, or announcing services, but contained coded intelligence readable only by operatives trained in the specific coding system. A typical coded personal ad might read, "For sale, mahogany desk, 3 drawers, excellent condition, call after 6 o'clock." To casual readers, this was a furniture advertisement, but to an intelligence operative with the code book, mahogany indicated the message type. 3 drawers encoded a numerical value, excellent condition specified urgency, and after 6 o'clock provided timing information. The ad communicated complete intelligence messages while appearing entirely innocent. More sophisticated codes exploited commercial shipping news. Swedish newspapers extensively covered Baltic shipping, departure schedules, cargo manifests, vessel movements, because Sweden's economy depended on maritime trade. Intelligence services developed codes using this shipping information. A report that SS Malmö departed Gothenburg at 1400, carrying timber, might encode intelligence about German naval movements. The departure time indicating coordinates, the cargo type specifying the intelligence category, and the vessel name pointing to which German naval unit the information concerned. Financial market reports provided another coding framework. Stock prices, currency exchange rates, and commodity prices varied daily, creating naturally changing numbers that could encode intelligence. An operative would monitor specific stocks or commodities according to a coding system. Perhaps Swedish steel industry stocks encoded German military production figures, while shipping company stocks encoded naval intelligence. The natural fluctuation of financial markets provided cover for transmitting numerical intelligence that appeared to be ordinary financial news. Sports scores and results offered surprisingly effective coding opportunities. Swedish newspapers covered international football matches, ice hockey games, and other sports extensively. Intelligence services developed codes where specific scores, player names, or team combinations encoded messages. A report that AIK Stockholm defeated Djurgården 3-1 might encode intelligence depending on the coding system. the score indicating specific operational data, the team's names pointing to geographic locations or units, and even the date of the match providing timing information. Weather reports contained coded intelligence. Swedish newspapers published detailed weather forecasts for Sweden and surrounding regions, information valuable for planning military operations. But beyond the obvious intelligence value of actual weather data, the reports themselves could encode additional intelligence. Specific temperature numbers, wind directions, or precipitation descriptions might follow coding systems that transmitted intelligence about non-weather subjects entirely. Cultural event listings and reviews served as coding frameworks. Swedish newspapers covered concerts, theater performances, art exhibitions, and other cultural activities extensively. Intelligence operatives would encode messages using these listings. Perhaps the concert program at Stockholm Concert Hall on Thursday encoded information based on which compositions were performed, or an art exhibition review contained intelligence in the specific paintings the reviewer chose to mention. Business directory advertisements provided coding infrastructure. Swedish newspapers ran extensive classified business directories listing companies, services, and contact information. Intelligence services would place or modify these business listings to encode intelligence. A listing for a furniture company might exist solely to communicate encoded messages through its address, phone number, or service descriptions, with no actual furniture business existing at all. Some codes exploited obituaries and death notices. Swedish newspapers published detailed death notices including biographical information about deceased persons. Intelligence services occasionally fabricated death notices for non-existent people, encoding intelligence in the biographical details. Or they'd modify real obituaries slightly, adding encoded information to otherwise genuine death announcements. This technique was particularly difficult to detect because death notices varied widely in format and content naturally.
Perhaps most sophisticated were codes embedded in actual news articles. Allied and Axis intelligence officers sometimes collaborated with Swedish journalists, wittingly or unwittingly, to embed codes within regular news stories. A journalist writing an article about Swedish-German trade relations might include specific statistics, quote particular officials, or mention certain towns in patterns that encoded intelligence according to pre-arranged systems. The article appeared entirely legitimate while simultaneously serving as an intelligence transmission medium. Sequential codes required reading multiple newspapers over time. Some intelligence messages were too complex to encode in a single newspaper issue. Instead, information would be split across multiple days' papers, with each day's coded content providing one piece of a larger intelligence puzzle. Operatives would collect several days' newspapers, extract the coded fragments from each, and reconstruct complete intelligence messages from the combined information. The networks. Who used the newspaper codes? Multiple intelligence networks exploited Swedish newspaper codes during World War II. Understanding who used these systems and how reveals the scope of Sweden's role as a neutral intelligence crossroads. British intelligence services, particularly MI6 and the Special Operations Executive, extensively used Swedish newspaper codes. Britain maintained diplomatic presence in Sweden throughout the war and operated covert intelligence networks monitoring German activities in Scandinavia. Swedish newspapers provided secure communication channels between London and British operatives in Sweden, occupied Norway, occupied Denmark, and even within Germany itself. German agents operating in Scandinavia would extract intelligence and encode it in personal advertisements or other newspaper content, knowing that MI6 in London monitored Swedish papers daily. The intelligence would reach London without requiring risky radio transmissions that German direction-finding equipment could detect. Conversely, MI6 in London could send instructions to Scandinavian networks by encoding messages in newspaper content that Swedish authorities would unknowingly publish.
German intelligence, the Abwehr and later SD security services, operated their own newspaper coding systems. Despite controlling much of Europe, Germany needed intelligence about Allied activities, Swedish intentions, and resistance networks. German intelligence officers stationed in Stockholm used Swedish newspapers to communicate with agents throughout Scandinavia and the Baltic region. They also monitored the papers, looking for Allied codes, attempting to penetrate British intelligence communications.
Soviet intelligence services operated extensively through Swedish newspapers. The NKVD maintained networks in Sweden, despite Soviet Union's complex relationship with Swedish neutrality. Soviet intelligence used newspaper codes to coordinate with communist resistance networks in occupied Norway, Finland, and the Baltic states. They also gathered intelligence about German activities that Soviet spies in Sweden encoded into newspaper content for transmission to Moscow. Polish intelligence in exile operated networks from Sweden coordinating with Polish resistance inside occupied Poland. The Polish Second Bureau, Poland's intelligence service, operating from exile after Poland's defeat, used Swedish newspapers to maintain communications with the Home Army and other Polish resistance networks. Messages encoded in Swedish papers would be extracted by Polish operatives who'd arrange for the information to reach Poland through various channels. Norwegian resistance networks relied heavily on Swedish newspaper codes. After Germany occupied Norway in 1940, Norwegian resistance operated across the border in Sweden while maintaining contact with resistance groups inside occupied Norway. Swedish newspapers provided relatively secure communication channels between Norwegian exile organizations in Sweden and resistance networks in Norway. Intelligence about German military installations in Norway would be encoded in Swedish papers by Norwegian operatives in Stockholm. Danish resistance similarly exploited Swedish newspaper codes after Denmark fell to German occupation. Danish resistance fighters could cross into Sweden more easily than Norwegians due to shorter distances and established smuggling routes. They'd deliver intelligence to contacts in Sweden who'd encode it in newspaper advertisements or articles, allowing the information to reach Allied intelligence without dangerous radio transmissions. American intelligence became increasingly involved in Swedish newspaper operations after the United States entered the war in December 1941. The Office of Strategic Services established operations in Stockholm using Swedish newspapers for communications with networks throughout German-occupied Europe. American naval intelligence particularly valued Swedish shipping news, which could be used to track German naval movements in the Baltic. Individual double agents used newspaper codes for their own purposes. Several documented cases involve agents nominally working for one intelligence service, but actually serving another, using Swedish newspaper codes to communicate with their true handlers while maintaining cover with the service they ostensibly served. The complexity of Swedish neutral status and multiple overlapping intelligence networks created opportunities for sophisticated double agent operations. Swedish intelligence services weren't merely passive observers. The Seaburon actively monitored foreign intelligence use of Swedish newspapers and sometimes exploited this monitoring for Swedish intelligence purposes. By tracking which advertisements appeared and correlating them with known intelligence activity, Swedish counterintelligence could deduce information about foreign intelligence operations, priorities, and networks without directly intercepting communications. Business intelligence and commercial espionage also used these systems. Corporations spying on competitors discovered that Swedish newspaper codes provided plausibly deniable communication channels. A Swedish company wanting to communicate secretly with foreign partners might use personal advertisements or business directory codes, exploiting the same infrastructure intelligence services used.
Key studies, specific operations. Several documented operations reveal how Swedish newspaper codes functioned in practice and their impact on World War II intelligence operations. One famous case involved British intelligence monitoring German ball bearing exports from Sweden to Germany. Ball bearings were critical for German war production, and Britain wanted to track quantities and timing of Swedish exports to assess German industrial capacity and potentially target exports for sabotage. British agents in Sweden gathered intelligence about ball bearing shipments and encoded it in Swedish financial newspaper reports about industrial production. The intelligence appeared as routine business news.
Swedish SKF reports increased bearing production, exports rose 15%, but contained encoded details about specific shipment schedules, quantities, and destinations. British Ministry of Economic Warfare analysts monitoring Swedish papers would decode this intelligence, building comprehensive pictures of German ball bearing supplies that informed both strategic bombing target selection and diplomatic pressure on Sweden to restrict exports. British agents in Sweden gathered intelligence about ball bearing shipments and encoded it in Swedish financial newspaper reports about industrial production. The intelligence appeared as routine business news. Swedish SKF reports increased bearing production, exports rose 15%, but contained encoded details about specific shipment schedules, quantities, and destinations. British Ministry of Economic Warfare analysts monitoring Swedish papers would decode this intelligence, building comprehensive pictures of German ball bearing supplies that informed both strategic bombing target selection and diplomatic pressure on Sweden to restrict exports. German intelligence detected this operation eventually, but struggled to prevent it without revealing they'd broken the British codes. If Germans publicly complained about specific newspaper articles, they'd signal to British intelligence that those particular coding methods had been compromised. Instead, Germans tried indirect countermeasures, pressuring Swedish authorities about unspecified security concerns regarding industrial reporting. Swedish newspapers, caught between British and German pressures, continued publishing information that satisfied both sides' intelligence needs while maintaining Swedish neutrality. Another documented operation involved Polish resistance coordinating sabotage operations against German transportation networks through Swedish newspaper personal advertisements. Polish resistance networks inside occupied Poland needed instructions and coordination from Polish intelligence in exile in Sweden, but couldn't maintain radio contact without detection. Instead, they used Swedish newspapers. A personal advertisement stating, "Seeking apartment, 2 rooms, must allow pets," near Central Station would encode operational orders for Polish resistance. 2 rooms, indicating the number of simultaneous operations. Allow pets, specifying which resistance cells should conduct them. And near Central Station, indicating that transportation infrastructure was the target. Polish resistance members inside Poland received Swedish newspapers through smuggling networks, decoded the advertisements, and executed operations based on instructions transmitted through Stockholm classifieds. This system allowed sophisticated multi-operation coordination without radio transmissions that German direction-finding equipment would locate. German counterintelligence eventually suspected Polish resistance was receiving instructions through some channel, but never definitively proved that Swedish newspapers were the medium. The ambiguity, intelligence could theoretically come from couriers, radio, or various other means, provided operational security. Soviet intelligence used Swedish newspaper weather reports to coordinate submarine operations in the Baltic. Soviet submarines operating in Baltic waters needed intelligence about German naval movements, but couldn't maintain constant radio contact with Soviet Naval Command without detection. Swedish newspaper weather reports provided coded communication channels. Soviet naval intelligence would encode German naval movement intelligence in weather forecast details published in Swedish papers. A weather report stating, "Stockholm, morning fog, afternoon clearing, wind northwest 15 knots, might encode information about German destroyer patrol patterns, the wind direction and speed indicating German naval course and speed, the fog and clearing describing visibility conditions that affected naval operations, and the specific city mentioned pointing to which Baltic sector the intelligence concerned." Soviet submarine commanders monitoring Swedish radio broadcasts of weather reports, which was natural for submarines needing weather information, would extract encoded naval intelligence without requiring compromising radio contact with Soviet command. German naval intelligence read the same weather reports for their actual meteorological value, while remaining unaware that Soviet submarines were extracting military intelligence from them. Norwegian resistance coordinated with British intelligence through Swedish shipping news to arrange supply drops and evacuations. Norwegian resistance needed supplies, weapons, explosives, radio equipment, and sometimes needed to evacuate injured operatives or extracted intelligence agents. Coordinating these operations required secure communications between Norway and Britain, which Swedish newspapers facilitated. A shipping news article reporting MS Bergen scheduled Narvik to Stockholm route, arriving Thursday, would encode instructions for a British supply drop operation. Bergen indicating the drop zone, Thursday specifying timing, and other article details encoding authentication codes resistance needed to verify the operation's legitimacy. British aircraft would conduct the supply drop, and Norwegian resistance would be positioned correctly because they decoded instructions from Swedish shipping news days earlier. German intelligence monitored these same shipping reports for actual shipping information, but apparently never systematically detected the intelligence encoding. The sheer volume of legitimate shipping news published in Swedish papers provided cover. Any particular report might or might not contain codes, making systematic detection practically impossible without knowing the specific coding systems used. Swedish awareness. How much did they know? Swedish authorities and journalists occupied complicated positions regarding newspaper codes. Their awareness varied from complete ignorance to active participation, creating ethical ambiguities that persisted throughout and after the war. Swedish counterintelligence definitely knew that foreign intelligence agencies used Swedish newspapers for covert communications. Declassified Swedish intelligence documents confirmed that the Seaburon monitored foreign intelligence activities and had identified newspaper coding as a significant element of intelligence operations in neutral Sweden. But Swedish authorities faced difficult choices about how to respond. Aggressively suppressing foreign intelligence use of Swedish newspapers would undermine Swedish neutrality. If Sweden prevented only Allied operations while allowing access codes, Germany would be satisfied, but Britain would view Sweden as pro-German. If Sweden suppressed only access operations, the reverse problem arose. And if Sweden suppressed all foreign intelligence operations equally, both sides would be antagonized, potentially threatening Swedish independence. The pragmatic solution was studied neutrality regarding newspaper codes. Swedish authorities monitored the activities, gathered intelligence about foreign intelligence operations for their own purposes, and intervened only when operations directly threatened Swedish security. This approach allowed Sweden to maintain relationships with all sides while extracting intelligence value from monitoring the intelligence warfare occurring within Swedish borders. Individual Swedish journalists' awareness varied significantly. Some definitely knew their work facilitated espionage. These journalists made conscious choices about which intelligence services to assist, usually Allied rather than Axis services, reflecting anti-Nazi sentiment common among Swedish intellectuals despite official neutrality. They'd cooperate with intelligence officers, agreeing to publish specific advertisements or write articles incorporating particular information that enabled intelligence coding. Other journalists suspected exploitation but avoided investigating too closely. Professional journalism required accessing information from various sources, some of whom might be intelligence operatives. A journalist receiving a tip about shipping movements or industrial production from a business source might suspect the source was actually an intelligence officer, but would publish the information anyway because it was newsworthy regardless of the source's true affiliation.
Still, other journalists remained completely unaware. They wrote articles about Swedish commerce, culture, or international affairs without realizing that intelligence services parsed their every word for encoded meanings or used their articles as frameworks for unrelated intelligence codes. These journalists were innocent participants whose work was exploited without their knowledge. Swedish newspaper editors faced similar dilemmas. Editors controlled what content appeared in their publications and could theoretically prevent intelligence services from using their papers for codes by refusing suspicious advertisements or articles. But distinguishing legitimate content from intelligence codes was extremely difficult, and editors had financial incentives to publish advertisements and articles regardless of potential intelligence uses. Some Swedish newspapers were more cooperative with particular intelligence services than others. Papers with editors sympathetic to the Allied cause might be more willing to publish content that facilitated British or American intelligence operations. Papers with different political leanings might be more accommodating to German intelligence. But most major Swedish newspapers attempted to maintain neutrality,
publishing content from various sources without systematically favoring any intelligence service. Swedish government officials occasionally communicated privately with newspaper editors about intelligence concerns. If Swedish counterintelligence detected an intelligence operation that risked compromising Swedish neutrality or security, they might quietly suggest to editors that certain types of content should be avoided temporarily. These informal communications allowed Swedish authorities to manage intelligence exploitation of newspapers without formal censorship that would undermine press freedom. The post-war period brought uncomfortable reckonings. Some Swedish journalists who'd actively assisted Allied intelligence during the war were celebrated as having contributed to defeating Nazism despite Swedish neutrality. Others faced criticism for having compromised journalistic integrity by serving intelligence services. Still others remained silent about their wartime activities, recognizing that admissions about facilitating espionage could damage their reputations or Swedish neutrality's historical reputation. Detection and counterintelligence. Both Allied and Axis intelligence services attempted to detect each other's use of Swedish newspaper codes, creating a complex game of cryptanalysis and counterintelligence played out through Stockholm publications. German counterintelligence made systematic efforts to penetrate Allied use of Swedish newspaper codes. The Abwehr stationed cryptanalysts in Stockholm, specifically tasked with monitoring Swedish press for potential Allied intelligence codes. These analysts collected newspapers daily, examined personal advertisements, tracked shipping news patterns, and attempted to identify coding systems through statistical analysis and pattern recognition. Germans achieved some success. Declassified post-war documents revealed that German intelligence identified several Allied coding systems using Swedish newspapers and occasionally intercepted intelligence transmitted through these channels. In some cases, Germans used this knowledge for counterintelligence, allowing the codes to continue operating while feeding false information through channels they'd compromised, attempting to deceive Allied intelligence with disinformation. But Germans never achieved comprehensive penetration of Allied newspaper codes. The systems were too numerous, changed too frequently, and exploited Swedish content in too many varied ways for complete decryption. German analysts might break one coding system only to discover allies had switched to a different method. The cat-and-mouse game continued throughout the war, with neither side achieving decisive advantage. Allied counterintelligence similarly attempted to penetrate Axis use of Swedish newspapers. British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park received Swedish newspapers and analyzed them for German and Soviet intelligence codes. American cryptanalysts joined these efforts after 1941. Allied codebreakers had advantages. They'd already broken various German codes through other means, giving them context that helped identify German intelligence patterns in Swedish press. Allies probably achieved better penetration of Axis newspaper codes than Germans did of Allied codes, though complete assessment remains impossible due to continued classification of some intelligence materials. Allied success partly reflected superior cryptanalysis capabilities developed through Enigma code breaking and partly resulted from better intelligence about German operations generally, which provided context for identifying German codes specifically. Swedish intelligence monitored all sides' newspaper coding operations, playing a unique role as neutral observer of multiple intelligence services activities. Swedish cryptanalysts didn't attempt to break foreign codes extensively. Sweden lacked resources for comprehensive cryptanalysis and prioritized understanding who was conducting intelligence operations over decrypting specific messages. But Swedish intelligence compiled extensive information about foreign intelligence networks in Sweden, including their newspaper coding activities. This monitoring sometimes produced unintended intelligence sharing. If Swedish intelligence detected a particularly dangerous intelligence operation that threatened to compromise Swedish neutrality or security, they might quietly tip off the threatened party without revealing surveillance capabilities. For instance, if German intelligence was using Swedish newspapers to coordinate operations that might provoke British diplomatic protests, Swedish intelligence might indirectly warn Germans to be more discreet. The detection efforts themselves generated intelligence. By monitoring who attempted to detect which codes, intelligence services could deduce information about opposing intelligence priorities and capabilities. If Germans suddenly intensified efforts to analyze Swedish shipping news, that suggested Germans suspected Allied naval intelligence was using that channel, which was itself valuable intelligence about German counterintelligence focus. Some codes were deliberately designed to be detected by specific audiences while remaining hidden from others. A relatively simple code that German intelligence might break could serve as a deception channel for Allied disinformation, while more sophisticated codes remained undetected. This multi-layered approach turned the detection game itself into an intelligence weapon.
The legacy: neutral nations as intelligence crossroads. Swedish newspaper codes during World War II established precedents and revealed principles that continue relevant to modern intelligence operations and information warfare conducted through ostensibly neutral channels. The operation demonstrated that neutral countries inevitably become intelligence battlegrounds during major conflicts. Geographic neutrality doesn't prevent intelligence exploitation. Instead, it creates unique opportunities for intelligence services that can't operate openly in enemy or occupied territory. Modern conflicts continue featuring neutral or non-aligned nations serving as intelligence crossroads despite official non-participation. Swedish newspaper codes revealed advantages of exploiting open-source information for covert communications. Rather than creating entirely clandestine communication systems vulnerable to detection, intelligence services embedded codes within legitimate public information flows. This principle influenced Cold War and contemporary intelligence tradecraft, where covert communications are often hidden within ordinary digital communications, financial transactions, or commercial activities. The operation highlighted challenges authoritarian powers face penetrating democratic societies' open information environments. Nazi Germany controlled press completely in territories under German occupation, but couldn't extend that control to neutral Sweden's free press. This asymmetry benefited Allied intelligence fighting authoritarian powers. Allied intelligence exploited Swedish press freedom more effectively than Axis intelligence did, partly because democratic intelligence services understood free press operations better than authoritarian intelligence services did. Post-war intelligence services studied Swedish newspaper operations as case studies in neutral nation intelligence exploitation. Both CIA and KGB analyzed how World War II intelligence services had used Swedish press, applying lessons to Cold War operations. Switzerland, Austria, Finland, and other neutral or non-allied nations became similar intelligence crossroads during Cold War, with their newspapers and media serving as covert communication channels just as Swedish papers had during World War II. Modern parallels exist in digital communications. Contemporary intelligence services embed codes in social media, online forums, comment sections, and various digital platforms the same way World War II services used Swedish newspapers, hiding intelligence communications within enormous volumes of ordinary content where detection is practically impossible without knowing specific coding systems. The medium changed from print to digital, but the principle remains identical. The ethical questions raised by Swedish newspaper operations persist. Journalists today face similar dilemmas about their work being exploited for intelligence purposes without their knowledge or consent. Media organizations in neutral or non-aligned nations continue serving as informal intelligence infrastructure, raising questions about journalistic integrity, neutrality, and unintended consequences of press freedom.
Swedish historians and journalists have extensively examined their country's World War II role, including newspaper intelligence operations. This historical examination produced complex assessments: pride that Swedish press freedom provided alternatives to Nazi information control, discomfort about Swedish neutrality facilitating Axis operations alongside Allied ones, and recognition that journalism operated in morally ambiguous spaces during wartime. The operation also demonstrated limitations of attempts to detect or suppress intelligence use of neutral information channels. Despite extensive German and Allied efforts to monitor each other's newspaper codes, neither side achieved complete success. The lesson persists in contemporary counterintelligence. Preventing adversaries from exploiting open information channels is practically impossible, so focus must shift to managing and mitigating risks rather than achieving complete prevention. Neutral Sweden's newspapers during World War II were far more than sources of news and information for Swedish readers. They were intelligence infrastructure, serving multiple warring powers simultaneously, covert communication networks hiding in plain sight within commercial news and classified advertisements, and battlegrounds where intelligence services fought invisible wars through codes that millions read but only a few could decode. Swedish journalists wrote about shipping schedules, financial markets, and cultural events, perhaps never realizing that every word might be parsed by intelligence operatives searching for encoded meanings. Or perhaps some journalists knew exactly what they were enabling, consciously choosing to facilitate Allied intelligence operations despite Swedish neutrality, believing that helping defeat Nazism justified compromising strict journalistic neutrality. The brilliance of using Swedish newspapers for intelligence communications lay in exploiting the obvious to hide the secret. Newspapers were ubiquitous, expected, unexceptional. Intelligence officers could meet in Stockholm cafes, read newspapers openly, and decode messages without arousing suspicion because reading newspapers was the most normal activity imaginable. The visibility provided invisibility. Covert operations conducted in public view of everyone, but detected by no one. Multiple intelligence services used the same newspapers simultaneously for different purposes, often unaware of each other's coding systems operating in parallel. British agents decoded shipping news for naval intelligence, while German agents decoded stock prices for industrial intelligence, while Soviet agents decoded weather reports for submarine coordination, all extracting different hidden meanings from the same Swedish publications that ordinary readers consumed for their face value content. Swedish neutrality made this possible. Had Sweden been occupied or aligned with either side, the free press enabling these operations would have been suppressed. But Swedish independence maintained throughout the war preserved free press freedom that inadvertently served intelligence purposes for all sides. Swedish neutrality's survival partly depended on providing these informal intelligence channels, allowing both Allied and Axis services to exploit Swedish newspapers, created balance that supported neutrality. The human dimension deserves remembering. Swedish journalists caught between pressures from multiple intelligence services, trying to maintain professional integrity while aware their work facilitated espionage. Intelligence operatives living undercover in Stockholm, reading newspapers in cafes while decoding messages that might prevent attacks or save lives. Resistance fighters in occupied Norway reading smuggled Swedish newspapers, finding encoded instructions that enabled them to continue fighting despite occupation. If this deep dive into how neutral Sweden's newspapers became hidden World War II intelligence networks captivated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised that neutral newspapers could serve so many intelligence services simultaneously? Can you see parallels to modern digital platforms being exploited for covert communications? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? Swiss banking's intelligence role? Turkish neutrality's intelligence implications? How other neutral nations' media served intelligence purposes? Share this video with anyone fascinated by intelligence operations, neutral nations in wartime, journalism ethics, or the hidden ways information channels serve purposes beyond their obvious functions. Until then, remember, the most valuable intelligence channels are often those hidden within the most mundane and publicly visible information sources. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.